Okay, so I have the pleasure to introduce Professor E. Patrick Johnson now. So this idea of difference, inclusion, and family is what Professor E. Patrick Johnson, the Chair of African American Studies, and the Carlos Montezuma Professor of Performance Studies and African American Studies at Northwestern University, will take up in his keynote entitled, "Are We Not Family? Sexuality, Citizenship, and Politics in the New Black South." And when we came up with this theme, I think I came up with E. Patrick before we came up with the theme, so it's all shaped around our lovely speakers today. I've had the opportunity to benefit both from Professor Johnson's generosity of spirit, so he and his partner Stephen throw some mean, multi-floor, multiple dessert parties in their lovely home in Chicago. And I've also benefited from the generosity of his intellect, for he's the author of numerous award-winning publications, such as Appropriating Blackness, Performance in the Politics of Authenticity, Sweet Tea, Black Gay Men of the South and Oral History, Black Queer Southern Women and Oral History. He also co-edited with Meiji Henderson, Black Queer Studies, a critical anthology, and he coined the term queer, which is very essential to those of us who do African American, and queer studies and gender and sexuality studies. He's currently working on a creative nonfiction text titled Honeypot, Black Southern Women Who Love Women. And he's a performer whose stage reading Pouring Tea, Black Gay Men of the South Tell Their Tales is based on the book Sweet Tea. And he's performed at over 100 colleges' campuses since 2006, and it's the basis of his film Making Sweet Tea, with anthropologist and film producer John L. Jackson, who's a very good friend of mine as well. And so I had the opportunity to write John and ask him, send me a quote that you would like to share about E. Patrick. And of course I did this last minute, so he was like, oh my God, it's tomorrow, Salamisha. But anyway, so he said, EPJ is redefining what scholarship looks like in ways that will change the academy forever by making it more inclusive and innovative. We are finishing a film that captures just a tiny bit of his process, and I hope it demonstrates as compelling as possible why his approach to scholarship is so transformational. I would like to welcome Professor Johnson to the stage.
I'm perklimped. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Just gonna have a drink of water. I would first like to thank Salamisha Tillett, Mark Kasovic, Jack Chen, Laura Triano, and the Clement A. Price Institute on Ethnicity and Culture and the Modern Experience here at Rutgers, Newark, for extending this invitation to me to deliver the Marion Thompson Wright keynote address. I also would like to acknowledge my fellow colleagues, Cheryl Dunier, who I've known for over 20 years now. I know, it's crazy, isn't it? Yeah. John Keene, who was a colleague of mine at Northwestern for many years, and I miss him dearly. Alexis Pauling, I know we can't, but I can mourn his loss. Alexis Pauline Gums, who is just a fierce warrior woman. I love you. She's doing amazing things. And Marcus Hunter, I won't infantilize you and say that you were once my student, but he too is just a trailblazer and doing amazing things. And it's a great honor and pleasure to share the stage with all of you. And to all of you who gathered here early this morning. This is church. To honor Professor Wright, thank you. It's an honor and a privilege. Like any good preacher worth his or her salt, I'm going to step on some toes this morning. Amen? For I believe that it is important that occasionally we be pushed beyond our comfort zones if we're going to continue to evolve as intellectuals as students, and as a community. And while racial politics are not always easy discussions to have, Black folk in general are not too shy when it comes to speaking truth to power regarding racism. Sex and sexuality, on the other hand, are quite a different story. We are less likely to engage this topic, and yet our sexuality is an integral part of who we are as humans. And relative to the history of Blacks in the United States, sexuality has shaped the ways in which we as a group of people have been deemed human and or inhuman, citizen or non-citizen, husband or step and fetch it, mother or mammy, son or rapist, daughter or Jezebel, and the list goes on and on. Indeed, even our notions of family are tied to the ways in which sexuality have been controlled and policed by institutionalized racism, which the police is a part of. Given this history, then, why is our community, the Black community that is, so reluctant to grapple with sexuality as a part of our history? And more to the point, why have we not done a better job of being vocal about the ways in which our queer kin play an integral role in and belong to the larger Black family? In my lecture today, Are We Not Family? Sexuality, Citizenship, and Politics in the New Black South, I will meditate on how sexuality and queer sexuality specifically is a taboo subject amongst Black folks, providing some historical context for why this is so, and then provide some examples of the ways in which Black queer folk resist being pushed to the margins in the Black community, how they resist being painted as the black sheep of the family, and especially in the South. Southerners do not talk about sex, any kind of sex. Then again, they talk about sex all the time. How can both of these statements be true? The answer is that when Southerners discuss sexuality, they use coded language that is not always discernible to the untrained ear. When Southerners engage in sex talk, euphemisms are often employed to refer to sexual organs and sex acts. It goes without saying then that taboo sexuality, such as homosexuality, is frequently spoken about in euphemistic terms. Homosexuals are referred to as that way, funny, sugar in the blood, sugar in the tank, light in the loafers, and so on and so forth. In Black Southern communities, these euphemisms for homosexuality exist alongside even more colorful nomenclature. However, beyond the sometimes derogatory and sometimes playful use of language regarding homosexuality in these communities, there are vexed and apparently contradictory attitudes toward homosexuals themselves. On the one hand, many Black Southerners frown upon homosexuality, more often on religious grounds. On the other hand, the Black Southern Church is a place where one might find an inordinate number of queer members. Amen? While there have been no scientific studies that verify the prevalence of Black queer folk in the church, there is an abundance of anecdotal evidence, oral histories, and even a popular novel, I Say a Little Prayer, written by Elin Harris, that suggests a large queer presence. For example, participation in the choir is a way to at once adhere to the religiosity of Southern culture while also providing opportunities to meet other Black queer folk. Based on several interviews with Black lesbians, for example, I have discovered that the stereotypical church lady, y'all ain't ready for this. I've discovered that the stereotypical church lady image prevalent in Black communities is one performance employed by lipstick lesbians to signal same-sex desire within the visual economy of the Black church. The church lady trope is typically associated with the woman who commands respect, both because of her devotion to a male god, the church, and to the pastor, also typically male. Her status in the church is matched only by her sartorial performance, which is typically in the form of bold colored dresses and shoes, and most importantly, a crown, a euphemism for a hat. While different kinds of women may be known as church ladies, there is only one first lady, or wife of the pastor of the church. A first lady's embodiment of the church lady trope, however, is typically taken a step further vis-a-vis her sartorial performance to index her position in the church. Indeed, the First Lady's investment in femininity through her appearance allegedly anchors her heterosexuality as an object of beauty for the other men in the church, who are to admire from afar, but particularly for her husband, the pastor. This high femme gender performance, however, is what LaMonda Stallings might call a trickster trope, which emphasizes indeterminacy, unpredictability, and fluidity, traits associated with queer, to argue how Black women embody difference within difference to enact agency over their sexuality. For example, one of the women I interviewed for Black Queer Southern Women narrates that upon meeting one pastor and his wife for the first time, the pastor's wife, a woman who was highly feminine in her self-presentation, propositioned her. Mm-hmm. That initial meeting led to a 6-year affair. Lisa was born in 1972 and reared in Grambling, Louisiana. This is how Lisa narrates the story of being seduced by the preacher's wife. I joined this church, and we had a Women's Day program, and they asked me to be on the program. And I remember sitting in the back of the church, and I felt like this lady was staring at me. And I was like, she can't be staring at me. So the next Wednesday, I went to youth ministry, and the guy that was a youth minister was also one of the associate pastors. After church, he introduced me to his wife. Well, it was the same woman who was staring at me from the choir stand. I was like, oh, okay. So that following Wednesday at church, she asked me for my number again. She said, you know what, I don't have time to be fooling around with Sam. Girl, give me your number. So I gave her this little card that had my number on it. And the next day she called me. She said, you know, I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but I'm attracted to you. And she was like, I don't know why I've never been attracted to a woman before. She gave me the whole spiel. Now, Susan was a bold woman, very feminine, beautiful. Oh, God. Petite, had a voice out of this world. That woman could sing. Oh, my God. She was the total package. She was the total package. So she came to my apartment one Sunday after church, and we spent the whole day together, just kind of, talking, playing around. And the next day she came back because, I didn't go to work the next day because I was so messed up in the head. And she came over as she got off work, and we ended up having sex. And I'll never forget, Susan said, now once we do this, we can't go back. That's what she said to me. And I'll never forget, God, almost 6 years later, is when we finally ended our relationship. Now, Lisa goes on to recount how over the 6 years that she and Susan engage in the affair, that she discovers that she's not the only woman with whom Susan is cheating on her husband with. This church lady deploys her high femme aesthetic and position as the first lady to turn out unsuspected female churchgoers. You can cut the slide. This is only one instance in which a seemingly repressive sacred space can yet become a site or conduit for the expression of sexual desire. What is more, queer folk are often incorporated into the fabric of Black Southern social and cultural life in ways that are anathema to its religious foundations, even though that inclusion still occurs largely on the premise of a don't ask, don't tell. Much of this has to do with the Black community's awareness of being under constant surveillance by whites and therefore not wanting to air dirty laundry, especially in light of a historical legacy of stereotyping African Americans as existing outside of normative sexuality. Black sensitivity to being seen as sexually deviant has meant that homosexuality as a socially taboo sexuality is often publicly disavowed. Homosexuality was even characterized by writer and Black Power movement activist Eldridge Cleaver and others as a white form of sexuality that infiltrated Black communities. Nonetheless, in private or beyond the gaze of whites, tacit tolerance of gays is quite common in Black Southern communities. Scholars Cornel West and Bell Hooks offer similar narratives that speak to the dual discourse among Blacks relative to tolerance and disavowal of Black queers. Cornel West says, I know when I was growing up in the Black community, most people knew that, let's say, the brother who played the organ in the church was a gay brother. And people would say, oh, that's so-and-so's child. You know, he's that way. And they just keep on moving. There wasn't an attempt, a focus on his sexuality. He was an integral part of that community. It wasn't a matter of trying to target him or someone pester him or openly, publicly degrade him. Those who said he's that way didn't believe that that way was desirable, but figured that he's just that's just why he was. That's just his thing, you know. But one of the ways in which he chose to function was to be part of his community. People knew it, but he just didn't make a big deal out of it. Cornel West. Meanwhile, Hooks calls attention to the hate the sin, not the sinner attitude of Black Christians when she says, in the past year, I talked about a Black woman, a Baptist minister who, although concerned about feminist issues, expressed every negative attitudes about homosexuality because she explained the Bible teaches that it is wrong. Yet in her daily life, she's tremendously supportive and caring of gay friends. When I asked her to explain this contradiction, she argued that it was not a contradiction. She argued that the Bible also teaches her to identify with those who are exploited and oppressed and to demand that they be treated justly. To her way of thinking, committing a sin did not mean that one should be exploited or oppressed. Both West and Hooks' comments reflect a conflicted attitude about homosexuality amongst Black folk, especially among Black Christians, that complicates the common notion that they are more homophobic than other minority groups in the U.S., and notably more homophobic than whites. In my book, Sweet Tea, Black Gay Men of the South and Oral History, I address these complex relationships and views between Black gay Southerners and their heterosexual community and their family members. Similar to the accounts of West and Hooks, many of the Black gay men in both urban and rural areas of the South stated that their communities, in most instances, embraced them as people, even if they disavowed their sexual orientation and employed the same religion they used to castigate them to also embrace them as fellow human beings. Certainly, none of the men with whom I spoke felt as if Black Southern people are more homophobic than others. Indeed, in some instances, my interviewees relayed stories that suggested that it was more common to hear stories about white queer people being disowned by fellow white Southerners than it was to hear such stories about Black Southerners. That is not to say, however, that Black folk, in general, don't have a long way to go when it comes to open acceptance of its queer members. In fact, some of the most vitriolic and hateful discourse about homosexuality has come from our pulpits, barbershops, beauty salons, and around the picnic tables. This was especially the case during the debate around gay marriage, when Rev Gregory Daniels of Chicago stated that, quote, "If the KKK opposes gay marriage, I would ride with them." Given that Black folks were not allowed to marry legally under the institution of slavery, were pathologized as a matriarchal society by the Moynihan Report, and Black women characterized as welfare queens by Ronald Reagan, how could we invoke such hatred toward queer brothers and sisters who desire to be in committed relationships, through marriage or otherwise? Part of this is due to the politics of respectability. In response to white supremacist practices in the late 1800s and at the turn of the 20th century, Black middle-class leaders and organizations, from W.E. Du Bois to the women's movement within the Black Baptist Church, devised a discourse around the politics of respectability in order to demonstrate Black humanity and intellectual and cultural equality. But as Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham notes, this political strategy was not solely directed at impressing whites. It was also used to, quote, condemn what the Black middle class perceived to be negative practices among their own people. This assimilationist leanings led to the insistence upon Blacks' conformity to the dominant society's norms of manners and morals, end quote. The results of the emergence of the politics of respectability among African American leaders was the cultivation of a set of strict codes of living that hearkened to Victorian values and ideals of social comportment. Given the pressure to counter racist images of Black masculinity and sexuality as deformed and bestial, Black male behavior was confined to genteel and dignified forms of masculinity at the turn of the 20th century, and Black female sexuality was confined to one of temperance and chastity. Homosexuality, of course, was anathema to such respectable presentations of gender and sexuality, and therefore condemned on not only religious grounds, but also cultural ones. The politics of Black respectability was not just a discourse imposed by Black middle-class heterosexuals onto Black queer people. There were instances where Southern Black queer people actually were some of the biggest proponents of Black respectability as well. Often seen as arbiters of high culture, Southern Black gays were rewarded with social clout and monetary gain for not only their contributions to the arts, fashion, and culture, but also their ability to be discreet about their sexuality. In turn, then, they were often spared from direct homophobic attacks by fellow Blacks. In his essay, Sissies at the Picnic, Roderick Ferguson recounts how his rural Georgian community accepted Edward LaRue, a flamboyant gay man with style and flair, but who never named his sexuality, because he prepared the children in the church for the Easter Sunday program. Ferguson writes, "He was what Mama and other Black women referred to as a pretty man. He strode down the aisle limp-wristed with designer sunglasses, fur coat, and two-tone wingtip shoes. All of us knew he was funny. We had heard our parents say it, but that didn't seem to matter much, for they entrusted him to teach us to talk proper and sing on key. Back then, they seemed to understand that, funny or not, he and men like him were part of us, little pieces in this mosaic that made up the neighborhood. This semi-privileged and protected position within in the community, and I say semi because the positioning did not fully endow these men with complete subjecthood, described by Ferguson, offers a more nuanced understanding of why Black queer folks may not choose to openly identify as gay. It would seem that despite the performance of a range of masculinities from heteronormative to effeminate, the naming of one's homosexuality was the line across no one ventured for fear of losing their status as a respectable Black and good, or as good men and good women. Despite this complicated don't ask, don't tell, down low dynamic in the Black community, there does exist examples of Black queer folk who openly demand their place within community. Indeed, based on research I've conducted over the last decade, I argue that Black queer people challenge the notion of the domestic site as only a heterosexual paradigm, constituting a reconfiguration of the very notion of family. Insofar as heterosexual formulations of home and family are intimately sutured to notions of nationhood and citizenship, the reappropriation of such terms in Black queer communities suggests that Black queer folk demonstrate that their sexuality does not discount them as citizens. Indeed, the testimonies, transgressive performances, and reappropriation of heterosexual tropes of domesticity also redress the breach committed by Black heterosexuals when they exclude Black queers from the category of Blackness. In so doing, Black queer folk disrupt the idealization of the nuclear family and the cultural logic of sexual citizenship as lodged in normative sexuality. A house is not a home. Deconstructing the American house. In his 1981 hit single, A House Is Not a Home, written by songwriter Hal David, Luther Vandross sensuously croons over a full orchestra the words of a song that solidifies the notion of home as opposed to house as the epitome of the heterosexual American dream. A chair is still a chair, even when there's no one sitting there. But a chair is not a house, and a house is not a home when there's no one there to hold you tight and no one there you can kiss good night. Oh, I'm not meant to live alone. Turn this house into a home when I climb the stairs and turn the key. Oh, baby, please be there, saying that you're still in love. Still in love. Still in love with me. Are you gonna be? All right, that's enough of that. Following the logic of the song, an empty chair is still physically as well as symbolically a chair. But a home, on the other hand, is just a mere house, unless it is inhabited physically by two loving heterosexual people. While one could persuasively argue that the song could apply to queer folk as well as heterosexuals feeling a desire to nest, the subtext of the song still suggests a heteronormative logic that homemaking is the ultimate sign of wholeness. Single persons, for example, who do not wish to live with another person, those who might not believe in monogamy or who are not themselves heterosexual, may only inhabit houses because a house is not a home. If there's no one there, you can kiss goodnight. The transformation of a house to a home then occurs under heteronormative terms, if and only if the speaker's significant other is waiting behind the door to declare his or her love. Vandross's song reveals how deeply the discourse of heteronormativity is embedded in the cultural logic of American popular culture. This investment in heterosexuality has everything to do with maintaining the image of the American dream, the stereotypic portrait of the father, mother, two kids, and a dog outside their home within the white picket fence. That this image has long since been diminished by the economic realities of late capitalism, the changing face of America, and the end of the Cold War is the very reason why such images and songs and discourse are now back in circulation. Thankfully, Southern Black queer artists such as Big Freedia from New Orleans, y'all know about Big Freedia, hey, have resisted this return to heteronormative logics by bouncing gender and sexuality categories altogether through their lyrics and transgressive performances of Black gender. Having been denied access to the dream or reality of home, Black queer folk have reconfigured the discourse of home as house. Simultaneously included and excluded from its discursive and material reach, home has always been an ambivalent site for Black queer folk. Ironically, this ambivalence has provided fertile ground to critique heterosexual claims to home. One place where this transgression has occurred, and particularly in the South, is within makeshift spaces of leisure. From house parties to formal dance clubs, many sites of countercultural performance function as a space where Black gay subjectivity is celebrated and affirmed. Because of its geography and the fact that even today there are still expansive swaths of open fields and farmland, the South lends itself to creating makeshift spaces for expressions and affirmations of libidinal desire. Discussing how slaves stole away for leisure, historian Stephanie Kemp argues that during slavery, the Southern landscape actually provided an opportunity for the enslaved to engage in illicit social activities. She writes, "Despite planters' tremendous effort, enslaved women and men routinely slipped away to attend illicit parties where such pleasures as eating, dancing, drinking, and dressing were among the main amusements," end quote. Because homosexuality as an identity emerged post-emancipation, one can only speculate about such spaces for enslaved queers. At the turn of the 20th century, Black sexual dissidents began to create spaces where they could be free to socialize away from the surveillance of family and heteronormative society, particularly given the stigma of homosexuality in Black communities that often led Black queers to be, in the words of Black gay writer Craig G. Harris, cut off from among their people. The important research of performance studies scholar Shane Vogel indicates that in the North, and specifically in Harlem during the 1920s, there emerged a Black queer nightlife scene in the form of the cabaret, defined as, quote, a central institution of American nightlife, end quote, where queers could sign and signify their sexuality as a way to push back against the racial uplift narrative so prevalent among Black elites at the time. While no such entity such as the cabaret existed in the South for Black queers during the early 20th century, the spaces that did exist were, like the cabaret, associated with deviant sexual practices, particularly women's prostitution, homosexuality, and Black-white relations. Indeed, the Juke Joint, or what one might think of as a makeshift club, was one site, particularly in rural Southern places in the 1930s and 1940s, where all manner of queerdom might manifest. Playwright and performer Sharon Bridgeforth captures this scene brilliantly in her performance novel Love Conjure Blues at a hoe house come Juke Joint, located somewhere in the Mississippi Delta, where the clientele is comprised of, quote, men's, women's, some that is both, some that is neither. One of these people present in the joint is a woman named Big Bill, a gender nonconforming musician who, along with two other queer performers, mesmerized the audience with their music. The narrator says, then suddenly the three of them hit a note all at the same time. Oh, with the sound. And I declare some kind of hunger spirit swept through the room, took everybody's mind in one swoop. After that was none but bodies feeding the feeling till Sunday sunrise just before first service. Shit. We still rest broken from all that business. This moment in Figures Flavors, as the Juke Joint is called, represents not the bourgeois sensibilities of the Harlem Cabaret, but rather the carrying on of working class queers in the Deep South, conjuring the spirit in a makeshift club, their bodies feeding and feeling of ecstasy brought on by music and song. While Bridgeforth provides a fictional account of Black Southern nightlife spaces, George Egerson, also known as Countess Vivian, a Black queer man born in New Orleans in 1912, provides a glimpse into Black queer nightlife in the 1930s and 1940s that speaks not only to a vibrant Black queer subculture, but also Black queer ingenuity among Black sex workers. Countess Vivian says, Julia Pimpé and several others put on dresses and hustle at night. And they wouldn't have nothing in the room but that bed and that one chair. And that one chair be in that room right there. And we had somebody in that room, and we used to call them the creepers. Because they creep to come in the door. Creep to come in the door. And while the trick was busy doing his business, they go in his pocket and steal his money. That went on for God knows how long, honey. That's why they didn't have nothing in the room, you see. Because if it got to be too big a haul, they have to get out of there, right? Because many times that person that got robbed would go get the police because they would be too. But if they didn't know the man was a woman, they'd be too ashamed to go get the police. And even if it was a real woman, they'd be too ashamed to let them know they was in there with them blacks. Because at that time, blacks and whites wasn't close. Of course, they're not all that close now. But then, too, they were further apart than they are today. So I asked him, so sometimes these were white men picking up Black hookers? Well, no, not sometimes. Always. Always Black men, honey. They weren't fooling around with those Black men because many of them was hustling, and they put on little dresses and hustle at night. And then I asked him, why? Because they didn't have any money? And he says, that's correct. You go where the money is. So speaking to the racial politics of New Orleans in the early 20th century and signifying on those same politics today, Countess calls out the white men who supposedly do not know that they are tricking with transgender hookers, while also commenting on the socioeconomic status of Black queers who become creepers to make ends meet. These hookers were not tricking with Black men, but with white men because, as Countess says, you go where the money is. In a subsequent interview, Countess shared his knowledge of how many of the transgender hookers rented houses called crypts, 2-room shotgun houses in the French Quarter, that they left unfurnished except for a bed and a chair. This allowed them both easy access to a trick's wallet and a quick escape to another place once their scheme was discovered. In her history of Storyville at the turn of the 20th century, historian Alicia Long notes that after the Civil War, New Orleans, quote, became a tourist destination that encouraged and facilitated indulgence, especially in prostitution and sex across the color line, end quote. Few historians, however, recount the city's transgression of same-sex prostitution across the color line. Ordained countess by a Black Russian drag queen named Olga. Countess Vivian was a part of a thriving Black queer community in New Orleans that took advantage of the loose sexual moral codes of the city and deployed them to resist racist practices meant to undermine their existence. At the same time, these Black sexual dissidents created a supportive community around sex work that not only sustained them financially, but socially as well. The houses, or crypts, that the trans sex workers cultivated to do their business also emerged as a site for a broader spectrum of queer nightlife that entailed socializing as a community around music and dance. Indeed, the Crips, detailed by Countess Vivian, is the prototype for the house party. Y'all know about the house party, I'm sure, which is still popular today, especially among Black Southern queers of a certain generation. House parties not only function as an agent of racial solidarity against racism, but also a communal site where Black people could love and support one another. Similarly, Black queers who were ostracized by their heterosexual counterparts adapted the practice as a way to provide a space to escape homophobia and to build their own sense of community. House parties were also a form of income for the hosts, who often charged an admission fee, and in the North they probably call rent parties. Y'all say, yep. In addition to selling drinks, without a liquor license, of course, sometimes the host would also sell food. In Durham, North Carolina, for instance, Jeff Smith, born in 1918 and one of my interviewees in Sweet Tea, was known for his house parties. Indeed, these parties were legendary in the sense that queers from across the state of North Carolina, as well as from neighboring states like Virginia and South Carolina, would travel to Durham to attend them. Smith held these parties for 50 years, from 1948, after he came home from World War II, until 1998. During this period, the clandestine nature of these parties provided a space for Black Southern queers who lived in conservative towns and small cities to party without fear of harassment. It was also a place where one could find out who the queers in the neighborhood were. The sense of community building explicit in Jeff opening up his house in the late 1940s captures the way in which the term house has evolved in the Black queer community over time, from being a space of refuge from anti-gay attitudes in Black community to being a refuge from anti-Black racism in white queer spaces. We are family. I got all my sisters with me. In her book, Families We Choose, anthropologist Kate Weston argues that the heterosexist culture in which we live assumes that there is a single model for what constitutes family. She writes, by representing the family as unitary object, these depictions also imply that everyone participates in identical sorts of kinship relations and subscribes to one universally agreed upon definition of family, end quote. As revealed in Jenny Livingston's 1991 documentary Paris is Burning, and the more recent representation of ballroom culture in the FX television series Pose, family is a term that is used to name the mutual bond Black and brown queer people feel one toward another. For the members of the ball houses and Black queer people in general, the concept of family is less about biological relationships and more about kinships formed through a sense of community. Again, this conception of family has its roots in the Black community at large, in that Black communities have always valued the notion of extended family, whereby non-biological kin are considered to be a part of one's kinship circle. Growing up in a small town in western North Carolina, I had several aunts, uncles, and cousins who were not related to me by blood, but who either lived in my neighborhood or who were longtime close friends of my biological family. Residential proximity and personal history both contributed to this sense of extended family. In most cases, my aunts and uncles were also surrogate mothers and fathers, as they were allowed to punish their peers' children if they were caught misbehaving. In almost formulaic ways, many a Black person who grew up in this kind of environment will testify that a whipping from your aunt was just a precursor to the whipping you would get when you got home. As cultural workers, Black queers incorporate and expand this notion of family within their circles. Thus, family has come to signify anyone who is queer, whether they are out or not. Rather than asking directly whether or not a person is gay, one might ask if the person is family. The interesting aspect of the use of family in this context is that it is used both as a coded term in the presence of heterosexuals and as a part of ordinary gay vernacular in all gay contexts. One of my interviewees, Rob, a native North Carolinian, explained to me why family is used in both contexts. Rob says, "You might use family in front of straight people, but only say it to another gay person in the room. You know how straight folks take everything so literally anyway." Case in point, I remember going home with one of my friends to his family reunion. He introduced me to one of his uncle who was fine as hell. And I was getting this little tingling, a little feeling from my gaydar when he shook my hand. So I asked my friend if his uncle was family. And his mama turned around and said, "Yeah, he's family. That's Roger's uncle." Me and Roger just fell out because we both knew what I meant. So we use family as a code, but we also use family when it's just gay people. I don't know why, because it's not a code in that context because we don't have to hide, but I guess it's just a way of including someone into the fold. It's like you enjoy the fact that somebody else is like you. Queer use of family, then, in heterosexual company functions to purposefully disguise the vernacular meaning of the term. One of the reasons heterosexuals are unable to read the double meaning of the term, but now those of you who are straight will know, is that many heterosexuals view the world from a heteronormative perspective. So while Black Americans in general may practice a more inclusive definition of the term family, that practice does not necessarily include queer kin. Thus, in Rob's anecdote, Roger's mother's misreading of the meaning of family may have had as much to do with the ways in which her heterosexuality limited the possibilities for what the term could mean, as it did her ignorance of gay vernacular. Queer usage, then, is a more ecumenical practice of family than in heterosexual Black families, where often one's queerness places one outside the bounds of Blackness and home. And in closing, there's no place like home. In his powerful essay, Brother to Brother, Words from the Heart, Joseph Beam captures well the complicated feelings Black queer people feel about home. Alienated from their biological families because of their sexuality, from the white gay communities because of their race, and from the white heterosexual world because of both, home becomes an ambivalent site for Black queer folk. Beam writes, quote, "When I speak of home, I mean not only the familial constellation from which I grew, but the entire Black community, the Black press, the Black church, Black academicians, the Black literati, and the Black left. Where is my reflection? I am most often rendered invisible, perceived as a threat to the family, or am tolerated if I am silent and conspicuous. I cannot go home as who I am, and that hurts me." Beam's hurt soon turns to anger. Rather than use that anger destructively, however, he desires to cull it in order to rebuild home as a place to which he can return. Use it, anger, to create Black community in which I can build my home surrounded by institutions that reflect and sustain me. Concurrent with that vision is the necessity to repave the road home, widening it so I can recall with all I have created to the home which is my birthright. It is my hope that we as a Black community continue to evolve and progress such that we can take up Beam's charge to repave the road home, widening it, so that when someone asks the question, "Are we family?" regardless of our sexual orientation, we can respond unequivocally with a resounding yes. Thank you.